So thank you very much, Kathy and Teresa, for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here, and it has been a long time in the coming. As if I could have walked here all the time. Secondly, obviously, I don't want any pity, and it's profoundly controversial for me to say this, but I have a bit of a cold, and I am a man. So I can't quite tell how loudly or clearly I'm talking. So you'll have to not be too shy and kind of cue me if I'm kind of going in the wrong direction volume-wise. Okay, so I'm very pleased to be invited to come here and give this talk. And what I want to do in the talk that I've done is I will talk to the paper, and I'll maybe read bits as I go along if I lose concentration. But basically I'll try and talk informally, because I think that makes for a better event, although you'll be the judge of that. What I want to do in this talk is, in a way, continue to kind of puzzle at something which has occupied me for over quite a long period of time, even when I didn't know it was occupying me, and that's the relationship between interests in out-of-school learning and school learning, in a way. And sometimes I've been involved in work that's used the term informal learning to do this, and sometimes I've been involved in structured, organised, what I call non-formal kinds of learning, which have taken place in out-of-school settings. And a lot, I think, of what I say, like all of these debates, reflects very much the kind of norms that I take at face value from the particular context that I know best, which is the English education system. And I am struck, and I think this may be a productive issue for us to consider over the next couple of days, how much some of the research and theorising around digital culture and learning in and out of school is very unreflective in some ways about the norms that we take to be taking place within the schooling. And this is a kind of key part of the theme that I want to talk about today. So, is that right? Yep. What I want to do in this is reflect very, very broadly and try and pull sort of some big picture ideas together around the impacts of digital culture on and for education, thinking both at kind of system level as well as kind of more locally. And in particular, I guess one of the things that's kind of vexed me over the years is trying to think about people's understanding of what might be new and different in education, and new and different about the digital moment that we're allegedly living through. And this will lead me towards the end to try and think about the possibility of understanding the sorts of system level change that are currently being aired, certainly in the UK, certainly I know about in the States, I'm sure here as well. I think underpinning all of this in a sense is a sense I have that we need to take more seriously, in a way, what I call the irrational and the utopian in policy and educational politics, that we're not necessarily talking about disinterested, reasonable evaluations of ideas or change, but very much it's a question of trying to negotiate deep-seated ambitions, desires, and kind of fantasies about what schooling does, what we want for our young people and our children. So the talk, or the paper that I've written, has got 5 sections. In the first one, which I guess is the main part of the talk, I'm going to run through something which will be relatively familiar to you, which I've called the netgeneration hypothesis, which is my way of talking about the series of alleged structural changes in forms of digital culture that some young people are engaging in, and which may or may not be signs of forms of change, either at a deep level or a superficial level. Secondly, but a little bit more briefly, because I think this will be well known to you, I'm going to sort of reprise how I've tried to map what I call the digital learning field, which is trying to sort of pull together the different kinds of disciplines that are kind of operating here, which again, I think will be a theme that will recur through during the next couple of days. The third section I want to think about what I've called crossings to nowhere. Well, I want to think about the ways in which many of us are very dissatisfied and find very problematic the ways in which young people's experiences of digital culture outside school is failing to find purchase within the school system, and I suppose vice versa in a way, and try and think a bit about that. And then penultimately think a little bit about the ways in which schooling and kind of wider discussions of learning have tried to build bridges or develop links and networks to think about building connections. And finally end with a few thoughts about kind of change in education systems. I think it's worthwhile saying at the outset, just in case you haven't guessed by now, that I am quite sceptical about some of the claims made for some of the newness and change in digital culture, new literacies, new digital literacies. There's so many news, you don't know when one's old. I think on the one hand, research has underwritten a notion of the strangeness and otherness of digital culture, trying to characterize fundamentally new and different literacies, ways of comprehending, manipulating, and even understanding knowledge. But the point I want to really sort of focus on in the talk is to think about the implications of this process of othering for the alleged deep structural difference between this digital world and the day-to-day mundanity of schooling. What I'm very kind of interested in trying to tease out is how, in our interest to kind of valorize and to explicate a kind of new domain, the implications for what this means about the ways in which we end up characterizing day-to-day schooling, and of course how that intersects with some of the very, very fervent policy debate around schooling that's going on at the moment. I think I've spoken to that. So, the net generation hypothesis, which is basically just a way of kind of trying to sum up the range of research which has tried to look into the characteristics of what is perceived to be a generational shift. And the kind of first point I want to make about this, and I think is very important, is about the use of the idea of a generation in characterizing the impact of digital technologies. Certainly a lot of research, of course, pays much more attention to effectively forms of class-based, unequal, lack of social justice kind of differentiations. So quite why, in some respects, we've all been quite keen to embrace a notion of generational change, as opposed to kind of fractional change, depending on what kind of child you are, what kind of childhood you experience, what kind of youth you are, is an interesting question. And secondly, people are very keen to jump on a sort of generational bandwagon without taking terribly seriously the idea about how you might measure or assess kind of generational change. It clearly, in some respects, without being too sort of prissy, it's just too early to talk about the notion of generational change, if there is generational change anyway, if you see what I mean. And I think, but nevertheless, that hasn't stopped the kind of popularity at kind of policy level, politician level, and everyday discourse level for a kind of everyday kind of sense of the differences that young people are kind of now experiencing. And the net generation kind of hypothesis basically tries to make the case that there's a difference between the net generation model of self-formation and traditional ones, that the kind of young people who are being produced through their experiences of digital culture are in some ways qualitatively different from older and other kinds of generation that pre-existed them. And this leads to a kind of dilemma. And around the world, the idea that school is in some sense crisis and there is a dilemma is very, very kind of crucial to this debate, because schools, teachers and parents are struggling, or appear to be, or are constructed to be struggling to come to terms with the gap between what's expected and what they're presented with day to day. So when you break down the research around net generation kind of hypotheses, I've tried to sort of break it down into three different kinds of area of kind of effect. And the first one is research which looks at how digital technology facilitates access to a wide range of public, civic, community, interest and friendship groupings. And there's sort of two dimensions of this. One is a particular kind of focus coming from an interest in civics. So people, and there's a lot of research which is very interested in the kind of citizenship that is now on offer through participation in digital culture, through forms of social networking, through forms of creative expression, through forms of participation online, and the kind of older notions of citizenship. And of course these debates about changing forms of citizenship are of course located in what is perceived to be a longer term decline in the form of social democratic consensus that we're kind of used to in some senses. And the other kind of side of this opportunity access kind of argument is around peers and friendship grouping. So you could, on the one hand, and people have written about this, hypothesize a notion of civics existing on a kind of continuum with notions of kind of community, so that how people engage in community can be seen both as a civic action and a precursor to other forms of citizenship activities. So the argument is that the participation in various forms of fora, whether they're playing games or in forms of social networking, give rise to forms of friendship groupings, interest-driven groupings, and that these, in a sense, encourage a different form of collective action, a different form of kind of collective consciousness, which we're all very vexed with, because clearly we're living in societies where that notion of collective participation is perceived to be declining, challenging very many heartfelt beliefs in fundamental kind of issues about social democratic consensus. The second dimension is slightly more, I don't know what the right word is, but it's more focused on sort of the individual qualities, as kind of skills, aptitudes kind of domain. And researchers looked at a lot of different notions of collective and collaborative activity as they affect the ways in which young people learn to behave. So this is often a research which identifies kind of forms of behaviour, which is kind of interesting. And the relatively recent book by Mimi Ito, for example, that came out of the MacArthur project, hanging out, messing around and geeking out, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't good. It's a good kind of example of that, where you've got a research and a kind of focus which is very interested in how these forms of engagement affect the individual, not necessarily as a kind of citizen in the way I was talking before, but as in terms of their kind of skills and aptitudes in that kind of way. And people have been, and there's a lot of research and kind of studies of attitudes and approaches to learning, looking particularly at kind of working in teams, particularly in the computer game, the literature around learning in computer games, about the handling of knowledge, about the use of just-in-time and multitasking and negotiation. And together, the research that we're kind of used to in this area basically is interested in trying to make a case that the agency of young people has changed as a kind of social actor. And broadly speaking, you have a literature which has a kind of hot and cold water kind of approach, that on the booster side, the hot water side, you have studies which look at examples where young people appear to be being able to kind of act in ways that one might not expect young people to be able to act. And then you have the kind of cold water approach, which kind of basically argues that many of this is kind of exaggerated or specific case studies. Trying to look again at how research has kind of, trying to characterize the research which has characterized the net generation. There's been a lot of attention to kind of skills and competence, and particular kind of focus and interest in producer and user kind of skills. And here there's been a range of research which is particularly interested in the creative opportunities and expressive opportunities that are afforded to young people in their access to production technologies. And this also has been looked at again this has also been looked at in concert with research which is focused on reassessing core reading skills, if you like, or user skills, because the arguments are, as I'm sure you well know, that as young people engage with a range of kind of new media texts, they in themselves contain forms of affordance and opportunity that are fundamentally kind of reconfiguring the kind of skill set and competency that you now need to be able to function as a young person in the digital age. Secondly, there's been a range of research which has looked at the more sort of cognitive learning science side of things. So people have been very interested in how engaging in digital culture changes attitudes to kind of modelling, forms of metacognition and information processing. And yet again, in a way that, to reiterate the point, the argument is in much of the research around digital culture, I suggest, is profoundly sort of exploratory, because it sort of says, here are young people and they're doing things that they wouldn't usually have done before. By way of kind of summary of this period of research, and obviously in the paper I've got the sort of full sets of references. We don't know how equal, far-reaching or widespread such changes are, but a series of identified behaviours which offer authentic and challenging learning experiences have been enumerated. And these coalesce around a different notion of the learning self, different, that is, from forms of such activity validated by current school arrangements. So in the new dispensation, young people can act with authority across a series of domains and are accustomed to forms of collaboration, genuine challenge, experimentation, risk-taking, curiosity, and expressivity. So I don't think anything I've said has been terribly original so far, but all I'm trying to do is to try and sort of summarise the characterisation of digital culture in order to start seeing how this works through in terms of wider debates about education. The second part of the paper looked at, I tried to do a sort of review of the ways in which digital learning tries to kind of map the field, because one of the difficulties in talking about this field of young people and digital culture and digital literacies is, of course, that it's interdisciplinary and it brings together a number of different education research kind of traditions. So as you know probably better than I in some respects in a way, literacy and new literacies have been at the forefront of much of this kind of research literature examining the new young person in digital culture. And it seems to me that there are both pros and cons in considering participation in digital culture as a literacy and as using new literacies as the kind of sledgehammer to kind of bash the way forward in this kind of attempt. And the second thing I kind of want to sort of, what has occurred to me in a way, thinking about this, is that a lot of the literacy studies, in a sense, the new literacy studies in their approach to digital culture, in a sense, it seems to me, is based on a version of sort of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, looking at the ways in which the use of kind of, in this case, technology and culture, transforms kind of thought and ways of thinking in that kind of way. And it seems to me that a lot of the kind of new literacies research in this field is trying to make the case about new and different and other ways of thinking that come out of the engagement with forms of digital culture. There's also, and I think it is important to be able to distinguish where disciplinary boundaries are colliding, a wide range of research which comes much more from learning science, which is interested in digital culture. So, and this, it seems to me, has two kind of characteristics. On the one hand, you have a kind of mind cognitivist kind of focus, which is very interested in new forms of kind of information processing, modelling, and thinking. But there's also quite a wide range of literature which looks at sort of the way in which participation in digital culture encourages a different version of the self, that it encourages a different kind of way of behaving. So if you look at literature like some of the OECD New Millennium Learners kind of work, and there have been a variety of studies looking at this sort of thing. There's a great attention to how forms of digital culture, participation in forms of digital culture, enable young people to work on the self as a project. They encourage forms of kind of behaviour and collaboration and self-presentation, which are much more derived from that kind of focus in a way. Thirdly, I think this will be familiar to you as well, obviously, there's a range of research which is interested in the ways in which, in what sense is participation in digital culture a preparation for work in the knowledge society. In what senses are there new kinds of work, new kinds of different kinds of labour are required for participation, and in what sense is behaving in the participating in computer games, social networking and so on and so forth merely forms of preparation for these new forms of precarious labour. And finally, as again you'll know, there's a great interest in digital culture from scholars and sociology of childhood and youth, and there particularly I think I draw attention to the ways in which an interest in an interest in commercialism drives much of the literature. In what ways is participation in this digital era merely, I say merely, in what ways are they forms of preparation for, in what ways are they really just ways of being involved, of participating in different kinds of education and out-of-school education marketplaces, and in what ways are the young people, in the sense, merely being prepared for different kind of forms of behaviour in that way. And it seems to me that each of these different kind of research, I don't think I explained that very well, but we can come back to it if need be. I think that each of these four kind of research traditions, which I think underpins this area, pinpoint different kind of dimensions of change which derive from their disciplinary paradigm in that kind of way. So by way of summary, I've kind of suggested there that either through a compound of learning theories or through an literacies approach, through studies which are ethnographic or social anthropology, even through study of the interpolating function of the market, there's considerable uniformity that learning outside the school is in some ways in serious competition with schooling. And this is the kind of point I want to kind of get to in this talk, that what I've done so far is try to focus on the characterizations of what's new and different. But I've been very sort of, what I'm trying to do in this talk, in a sense, is try and think about the ways in which that every time we valorize and investigate what's new and what's different, we are, in effect, devalorizing the other half of the binary. And this strikes me as the kind of dilemma in this kind of approach, in that kind of sense, because it's very difficult, I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, to talk about schooling in general in any case. It's very difficult to talk about normative models of schooling. But the last 15 years particularly have seen a slew of research projects, a slew of publications. I dare say I've contributed to some of them. And a whole range of different kinds of policy rhetoric about the kind of change that I've been describing. And the point I'm trying to get across here is that this, within this, the ambitions and the desire to kind of characterize the new has had an incredible effect on the ways in which the other has been kind of described and defined. That schooling, as the other half of the coin, as it were, has had to bear the brunt for being the obverse of what's being different. So for all the kind of characterization of the exciting, the different, the ways in which young people are now presumed to have different kinds of social agency and so on and so forth, it's all been developed in concert with a debate about and a discussion about the ways in which this is not possible in schooling. So what you've ended up with is a kind of absolute kind of restatement of a kind of failure of schooling against the kind of success of digital culture. And I think this is a very powerful and attractive policy rhetoric for a variety of reasons. And I think it's been very difficult, and I think, but partly because obviously there is some common sense to it, but partly because it's absolutely, it leads to a very unsatisfactory state of affairs, and this is what I want to move on to in the next bit of this discussion. Because what I'm kind of suggesting is that by constructing informal learning, digital culture as other and different, the literature works to construct a tension between the idea of a qualitatively new and different kinds of learning and a normative construction of school learning. And I think this is particularly kind of problematic in a kind of literacy framework as well, for a variety of reasons. So, as again you'll know in many respects, what we've been living through, I guess, I don't know if this is happening in Canada as well, but certainly in the UK, certainly in the States, is a kind of perpetual attempt to kind of destabilize and create a series of crises in public education. That there's constant kind of sense of schools failing children, a constant sense of education being crisis and being unsuitable and unfit and all the rest of it. And what I want to do in a way is to try and work out, what I've been trying to do, is to try to work out in what ways this research and this policy and this advocacy around new technologies and digital culture, in what sense is that a response to a crisis in education, or is it in fact part of the construction of the crisis in education? Is it, in what ways is it a kind of cause or a symptom of the kind of debates that we have about the condition that our schools are in, because in some sense people can make an appeal to an other, more kind of productive kind of world of learning that takes place outside the school in that sense. And in that sense, it's a kind of very slippery debate. So I, having written stuff where, for example, I've been very enthusiastic about some of the kind of potential and possibility and excitement that clearly goes on in forms of learning outside school, playing computer games, being on social networks and so forth. It's not quite clear, it seems to me, how helpful that debate is in some ways, and how it's kind of used and taken up within the kind of context of the debate about public education. Secondly, as you can see there, obviously mentioned the kind of idea of privatization. And again, given that digital culture has been completely and significantly kind of driven through a series of kind of commercial interests, it's very difficult for all the attempts to kind of recuperate the power of individuals within the market. It's been very difficult to kind of make a case about the ways in which advocates of forms of digital culture are in effect doing no more than simply making a case for the kind of commercial opportunities which are being opened up in education systems in that kind of way. And the third kind of argument that I think has gone on with the debate around digital culture has been the development of what I've called a kind of counterculture avant-garde. I don't think this is quite the right term, but certainly there's been a lot of literature which has looked at young people who found a way of kind of getting ahead by breaking the rules, as it were. And again, there's been a sort of romanticisation, I think, at best, and a sort of rather disingenuous failure to look at cultural capital on the other, examination of the ways in which it's as if you can kind of bypass the education system if you're kind of particularly cool in digital culture and education, that you can kind of get around the system in that way, and that you can be ahead of the game, and there's a certain sort of validation of this kind of avant-garde, the sort of digital avant-garde, which creates great challenges, it seems to me, for examining notions of education as a social justice project, which kind of clearly underpins the ways in which most education systems are kind of financed and kind of developed in many Western countries. So what has happened, I don't know what's happened here in Canada, and I'm looking forward to hearing about it, I guess, a bit. What has happened when forms of learning outside the school, learning in the digital bedroom, learning in youth clubs, has come to the school gates? What's happened in schools? How have schools kind of typically responded? And I think they've responded, from what I know, in a kind of variety of ways. Sometimes there's an attempt to kind of ignore these changes, as if the teachers don't want to know what young people are doing at a school. Of course, a lot of the digital culture issues raise very, very sensitive legal regulatory dimensions. The whole thing about whether, can teachers be on Facebook with kids? The whole issue about the whole question of kind of behaviours online and boundary crossing between adults and kids. So a lot of schools, when faced with this kind of dilemma, just don't want to know, and they kind of say that, so they kind of ignore what goes on. Sometimes you have kind of attempts where people try and recuperate forms of out-of-school learning for in-school learning. So the games movement particularly has gone down this route a lot, as if the pleasures of playing the kinds of games that kids kind of get into out of school can in some way be harnessed in a kind of pro-social kind of way. So that there's the Quest to Learn school, isn't there, in New York? Some of you may know about that. And there have been a lot of attempts to kind of develop software which kind of effectively build on forms of game playing, as if kids are not going to realise that suddenly they're in school learning something as opposed to doing something at home. I mean, some of these situations you're going to know more about, you'll know about anyway, and some of them are more successful than in others. In some cases, digital technology has been used as a form of sort of enrichment activities. So it's like if you're very good, you can kind of, you're allowed to bring things in. So, I mean, I think one of the things that's worthwhile making the point here is that in generalizing about schooling and about digital culture, the question of the age of the children involved is pretty salient, really. So that there are clearly very obvious practical differences between how primary, elementary school kids work and how early entry into early literacy is kind of taught and developed, and the kind of relationships and relationships that teachers have with children, younger children, and the ways in which out-of-school culture has a different kind of place in a primary school to what happens in a secondary school are kind of pretty important in that sense. So it's often actually pretty difficult to kind of generalise about these things, because I think those sorts of practical issues are often kind of pretty important. Obviously, there's a big issue around the question of assessment. Bobby Hammett's and Anna's Burke's book has tried to kind of set some models working to kind of get over this, about the question of forms of assessment. And you see this cutting both ways. So I don't know if any of you watch Escapist. Do any of you follow Escapist, the Game Players channel? They do these little animations. And there was one recently about gamification of education, where they suggested all different ways in which you could adapt forms of assessment in computer games, which clearly are a very hierarchical, progression-led kind of model of assessment, into formal education. So the teachers would have to learn some of these kind of techniques and apply them. But there are other ways in which some some schools and some teachers have tried to sort of develop forms of assessment, both looking at different kind of models of grading that come from out-of-school experiences, or adapting in-school experiences. But these are just very difficult challenges. Some schools have used what I call the dressings of modernity, which is a bit unfair. I mean, there's a school, a reference in the paper that has in London that I work with, has a fantastic kind of online presence, a lot of kids blogging and stuff like that. And the head loves it because it makes his school look trendy, and the kids are kind of cutting edge and all the rest of it. But it's very limited, the kind of difference it makes to the learning, but the kind of performance of them being a kind of modern contemporary school is a kind of big issue. What has been very difficult is to get kind of forms of curriculum development. And again, I mean, the context I know is pretty depressing, the English curriculum model. I don't know how things are here in a way. But it's been very difficult to, there haven't been, as yet, very many examples of large-scale curriculum change and development programs which have kind of acknowledged some of these kinds of challenges and tried to kind of build them in productively into curriculum, because it's been very difficult. It would be very difficult, I can imagine, to get a sort of political narrative which could justify that kind of approach in that kind of way. That for most, in many cases, the kind of politicians that I know, the kind of political rhetoric that I'm familiar with, is much more familiar with a kind of clear distinction between what's formal knowledge and informal knowledge, and now the twain shall meet kind of thing. And the third kind of thing that's got the final thing, sorry, third, I don't know why I said that, that's going on are forms of kind of recontextualization, where this is a term taken from the British sociologist Basil Bernstein, who looked at the ways in which when knowledge is brought into schools, it's basically turned into school forms of knowledge. So then you have the kind of final kind of insult to injury kind of dilemma, that if you are to, and can take forms of informal knowledge, digital culture, and bring them into school, in what ways are you merely going to, what could their status be? And the answer is that the chances are they'll then get recontextualized, they'll get re-inscribed, there'll be different kind of terminologies used, different kinds of languages of description, and they'll become incorporated into a formal school knowledge, which will kind of defeat the object of the exercise in the first place. And there are kind of no answers to any of this. What there aren't, it seems to me, are enough kind of research projects which kind of find a way of drawing these different kinds of models of crossover together. There aren't, a lot of the kind of work that has gone on in academic terms has been quite kind of local, it seems to me. It's been quite difficult to find examples, to bring together larger examples of kind of school and system change at this way. So, as I've just said, really, there's actually no evidence about what might be called deep change from the world of compulsory education, about how the private, leisure-driven world of digital learning may be transforming public education at institution or system level. And I think, I mean, on one level, some of this is going to come. It's just a question of time. But the other kind of challenge is that a lot of the work we've all done has been relatively on the margins, has been relatively coming from a kind of critical tradition, or kind of relatively kind of unpopular, and it has been difficult to find examples where national policy has kind of found it easy to accommodate these sorts of changes. I do know from opportunities I've had that some Scandinavian countries have done a little bit better on this front. So Norway, for example, has a whole notion of digital competence, which is integrated as a kind of core curriculum theme. And those Scandinavian countries, for a variety of other reasons, in many ways, have found some easier ways to incorporate forms of digital culture within the curriculum. But a lot of these, in countries that have high-stakes testing and mandated curriculum and no teacher, very little teacher autonomy, it's actually very, very difficult to instigate and develop the kind of change models that you might be interested in. So, drawing towards a conclusion, if there is a conclusion in a way, clearly what I've tried to do in a way is kind of, well, I hope I've tried to tease out some of the differences. What I'm trying to, one of the kind of themes that kind of emerges here in this kind of conflict of values between participation in digital culture and looking at kind of state education systems, is of course the fact that digital culture has a highly individualistic address, which has been analysed as a form of consumer address. And in that sense, that's also very different from the collective address of mass education systems, who of course are as much interested in the kind of communal and the many as in the individual in that sense. In the UK, they tried for a time to develop something called personalised learning. Have you heard of this term? And this is a sort of, do you have personalised learning? And this is a sort of attempt to kind of mediate the kind of address, the individualistic address, which young people are used to through their participation in forms of digital culture, with what is perceived to be the reverse, the lack of an individual address in school systems. The second kind of issue I've got here is around workforce development and the ways in which contemporary education systems are very ambiguous about whether they exist to develop individuals, about the ways in which they exist to produce different forms of stratification for employment. Again, it seems to me digital culture has played an interesting role in that kind of debate, as the tensions around, in England, the big phrase, big kind of obsession is with social mobility. Do you have social mobility here? That's nice. Part of the kind of settlement around education, the education system is the kind of belief that will offer forms of social mobility to all in that kind of sense. That's the kind of bargain between citizen and state in some respect. And the ways in which crisis in education appears to be undermining that kind of contract, and the ways in which participation in forms of digital culture seems to offer new ways of recontractualizing that relationship, is also part of this larger discussion. I've written there about the place of informal learning, about what exactly is its status, how and in what ways can it be integrated with other kinds of knowledge. And finally, I've kind of made reference to the point that I made at the beginning of the talk around what I call the pleasures of the other and the exotic, that in that sense, so much of our kind of interest in digital culture is as much kind of motivated by its desire to kind of other it, to make it exotic and exciting. Although what I've tried to suggest throughout the talk in a way is how that process of othering, of making strange and different, in a way reflects back on the norm, on schooling, on school education, and so that the more we kind of try to investigate forms of digital culture, and the more research turns its attention to that as a kind of productive space for educational intervention, the more I think we need to think responsibly about the negative implications of that process for the school system. So I think I'll stop there. I hope that was clear. As I was talking, although it may not have appeared so, I could feel sort of the waves of Atlantic kind of crossing my mind. So I hope that was clear enough. And thank you very much.
Questions? Go ahead.
Julie, that was a great tour and a great way of framing a lot of questions and tensions for the rest of the session. I want to go back to the social justice agenda that you referred to a couple of times, and not ask you to clarify, but maybe talk a little bit more about its relationship in terms of the potential that we've seen technology in a romantic way associated with social justice issues, with democratic and revolutionary forces. And there are clearly teachers who are using it in that way, a very small number. So it's not antithetical in principle, but I thought you were suggesting maybe that the technology was taking the foreground and social justice issues might have been waylaid in light of the exotic attraction maybe of the technology, or?
Well, there are sort of a number of levels to this. One is, it's a bit unclear. Well, there is an argument that access to technology in itself and participation in the culture, which is the kind of the frame I kind of honestly prefer, is enabling greater opportunities because of low access and low boundaries to participation. And I'm thinking that I was reading in Craig Watkins' book, The Young and the Digital, for example, who argues that actually young black and Latino youth are more likely to be found online than their white peers, for example, which might indicate that groups that one might imagine are more socially excluded are in fact more digitally included, if you sort of mean, from that point of view. So there is an argument that there's a sort of form of native or natural kind of ways of kind of creating opportunities in that way. But on the other hand, I'm also familiar with research which would say that it was more privileged youth and more affluent kids who have access and participate in digital culture. So if you look at who are the digital citizens or the participants, the arguments I think are that they're more, I mean, respect to Craig's work and stuff, but my experience is they're more like to be middle class kids who have access to all these kind of technologies and all the rest of it, and therefore access is profoundly unequal and experiences in that kind of way. That's kind of one aspect of the issue. But your question was also about the radical potential, more radical critical potential as things have been taken up in schooling, and that's clearly, there are clearly different kinds of spaces and different kinds of schools and different kinds of teaching. So there seems to be a real problem about how one knows about the depth and range of the exceptional versus the kind of, which I guess is always a problem in this kind of field. But I do worry a bit that a lot of exceptional cases are taken for proving the rule in that kind of sense. So that's a kind of.
But as points of inspiration, as points of, I think that's part of what we're looking for, rather than a measure of degree of take-up, maybe. The romantics among us.
Well, I'd feel better about, put simply, the inspirational side of things, if you see what I mean, if I felt that it was having much kind of beneficial effect. But I guess what I'm really kind of suggesting is I think that the inspirational, which is great, and the situations I've done and been involved in are fantastic, but I think it tends to be used as a stick to beat the kind of, it ends up merely pointing out how bad everything else is, if you see what I mean, rather than, in a sense, inspiring change. And there isn't much evidence that such a process does inspire change or create change in that way. And in fact, it possibly has a kind of, as I say, the kind of reverse effect. Not that I'm saying, not that there's much we can do about that. You know what I mean? When people are going to carry on doing exciting things in their classrooms, those of them that do, if you see what I mean. And I'm not saying we shouldn't, but it seems to me that often innovation and excitement is actually incorporated in a kind of debate, a wider kind of argument to show how feeble and kind of failing education is in that kind of way. And that strikes me as being undesirable.
Any questions or comments? Suzanne?
I think I'd like to, thanks also for that great review and for introducing some really interesting questions. I think I'd also like to sort of take up, and maybe, to be honest, argue with you about something that, in some way we agree about, which is this notion of generational change. And I also think that these Prenskyite sort of categories of all that stuff, I can't even almost bring myself to say the words anymore. Anyway, that stuff.
Okay, I know what you mean. Yes, yeah.
And we all know that that's all cross-cut by race and gender and economics and education and all that stuff. But I was thinking about the deeper sense that you're also right there, deep change, what deep change. The deeper sense, which is very much connected to, I mean, if digital culture means anything at all, it refers to relations between people and tools. And I was thinking in getting ready for this, the next few days, about that old work that Illich did on lay literacy.
Huh.
And if you remember, you didn't have to be able to read or write in order to be profoundly affected by the models and metaphors for understanding everything from interior life to public life to legal, conditions and so on. To be profoundly affected by the way that the book and literacy and reading was a model for that. And I think even in schools now, even if people, first of all, whether or not you use the computer, I think these same things are happening, that there are these impacts that are profound and not all of them are lovely. And even just the existence of computers in schools created, for example, some losses to the position of women and children in schools, and created some new forms of authority, whether or not they were ever actually exercised. It was as if, you know that when you go shopping, that if something goes wrong, basically they tell you that the computer knows, even if they don't understand this. So in that lay literacy sense, I'd want to argue that because the concept of digital culture is very much about that relation of people and tools, that there has been both generational, necessarily, and deep change. So, yeah.
Because it offers a different possibility about a way of thinking.
Yes, that's at the very least that, and that has impacts on authority, responsibility, forms of identity, ways of behaving, ways of organizing power, legitimacy, all of that stuff. In exactly the same, in a parallel way, because it's the same situation really. What Illich was addressing when he talked about lay literacy in the 12th century and that kind of development, it's the same sort of thing now, isn't it? In some way, we've got new tools that are becoming mass scale distributed, that are taking up vernaculars, that are destabilizing traditional authority structures. And so if his argument about lay literacy was good then, why ain't it good now?
I think I should probably resist answering that one. I think that's a good question. I mean, ask something that's been another question. I'll come back to that one then. Because I don't. Where's the evidence? Is the kind of question then in that sense. I mean, what kind of I mean, it's possible we're living through a period where schooling itself is going to be radically changed. Okay, I'm not. Let's hope so. Do you see what I mean? But there's no evidence to suggest that.
It's already radically changed. Like the ways that our relations to texts are different, our relations to interpretation are different, the literate practices we engage in, the ways we organize school and authority relations in school, epistemic authority, where we go to find things out, what we think finding things out looks like. And I'll leave it up to other people to say how, but I think there's all kinds of evidence of changes at these times. But I might be on my own. None of the others have seen it yet. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think what Suzanne is saying is so right. I think broadly speaking, the sense of anxiety itself around schooling speaks to the way the lay literacies of digital culture has, even in those school districts in BC, British Columbia, for instance, which have taken a kind of curious and resistant stance against integrating various kinds of digital resources into the classroom for lots of infrastructural and pedagogical reasons, right? There's a sense that there's a moment of displacement between the learning project and the learning outcomes that is broadly felt as an outcome or related to questions of the digital code. And I think that part of what your talk speaks to, Julian, is the danger of not attending to the way the public school system becomes a particular kind of target for that in the way that that lends credence to a kind of neoliberal project of privatization of schooling, right? Like in the U.S., I mean, I think across the border, one of the views is, my God, the way, or at least my sense is, I'll speak to me, there's an immense way that removal of the public from the educational project finds resonance in the U.S. that is resisted in this particular national imaginary, I think, to a large extent. But, and that's what your talk speaks to for me, is the need to be clear that this anxiety does not mean that the public project of education is undone, but that it is itself undergoing a profound change that many schools have a very, and educators have a very difficult time working with and reconciling with. On the other hand, I actually think that you know, some of those exceptional projects John pointed to, and that many people in this room do research on, they inevitably aggregate to something more, right? Like there, you know, there's a lot of case studies and a lot of small instances which suggest a kind of momentum that is, maybe it's two generations or something before these things actually settle in and transform the built structure and practices of the schooling system. But there's a sense of dislocation that is intersecting all of these kinds of issues, I think. But change is, you know, moving. There's a momentum there that's moving in useful and interesting ways. I think that those romantic resource or examples John pointed to, you want to hold on to, because otherwise you give up the agenda, which is a deep risk, I think, around public education.
Any comments or questions? This is, of course, not your only opportunity to engage in this conversation. Anything else? Do you see anybody else? Going.
People want to drink.
They want yes, and socialize. So perhaps I'll take this time to let Julian off the official hook, realizing that it's after 1 in the morning Britain time. So you know that's a really bad time for me anyway. So I hope you will join me in thanking Julian for beginning the conversation.